This week, it was confirmed Britain has suffered the highest level of excess deaths in Europe. And with COVID cases spiking, whole regions of the country are facing new restrictions as measures to further loosen the lockdown nationwide have been put on hold. It's hard to dress this up as anything but abject failure. But as is habitual for Tories, in a tight spot, an age-old strategy has been employed. When there is a failure, blame someone else. And as I suppose is classic for this party of government, they are blaming the Muslims or the ethnic minorities, the immigrants. These are the people to blame for a second spike of coronavirus, according to a Conservative Party MP speaking today on LBC. That's going to be our main story for this evening. I'll be joined by Aaron Bastani in a moment, as usual, for a Friday night show. And we're also going to be talking about the pretty outrageous list of government cronies given seats in the House of Lords, and speak to a Corbynite who this week won a legal dispute with Tracy Ann-Oberman and Rachel Riley at a great cost to herself. As usual, we want to get more people watching this show live. And we did tweet about it a bit late today, so share the show link, get more people watching on this Friday night. First story. Two big developments happened in the last 24 hours with respect to the UK government's response to COVID-19. Late last night, it was announced on Twitter that due to a spike in cases in the northwest of England, new restrictions would be put in place on meetings between households. We're going to talk about that in more detail in a moment. But first of all, at lunchtime today, after announcing that daily cases of coronavirus in England were up from an estimated 2,800 to 4,200, Boris Johnson said this.
And you remember, at every point I have said, our plan to reopen the society and the economy is conditional, that it relies on continued progress against the virus, and we would not hesitate to put the brakes on if required. With those numbers creeping up, our assessment is that we should now squeeze that brake pedal in order to keep the virus under control.
Yes, we are putting the brakes on, which means that the scheduled loosening of the lockdown due to kick in tomorrow is no longer going to take place. Now, don't be too worried unless we've got some quite niche viewers who are obsessed with bowling or gambling in casinos. This may not affect you. And also close contact services, which I think is sort of beauty services where the person who's delivering the service is quite close to your face. That's not going to be on anywhere in the country, or in England at least, tomorrow. In addition, masks will be made mandatory in more indoor spaces, extending to museums and cinemas. Now, I imagine, as I've said, few of you will probably be too worried about the bowling alleys and the casinos. If you live in the northwest, the demand that you do not visit other people's houses is probably, a bit more annoying. But this is not disastrous. Chris Whitty, though, the chief medical officer, did imply there could be tougher choices ahead.
I think what we're seeing from the data from ONS and other data is that we have probably reached near the limits or the limits of what we can do in terms of opening up society. So what that means, potentially, is if we wish to do more things in the future, we may have to do less of some other things. And these will be difficult trade-offs, some of which will be decisions of government and some of which are for all of us as citizens to do. But we have to be realistic about this. The idea that we can open up everything and keep the virus under control is clearly wrong. And what we're seeing is that we are at the outer edge of what we can do, and therefore choices will need to be made. But people, I think, are very clear, for example, that schools are an absolute priority for the welfare of children.
So that was Chris Whitty. A big contrast there to Boris Johnson a couple of weeks ago saying that social distancing measures could be abandoned by November. Chris Whitty saying, obviously, we've tried to do some loosening. We're at the absolute limit of what we can do without the R number, the reproduction rate going above 1 and exponential growth starting. So if we want to open up different parts of society or the economy, we're actually going to have to close down other parts. And this to me seems, a very common sense thing to say. I think that actually Labour should have been making this argument earlier. At the moment, I think we've been having a debate which pitches people who are, pro-loosening or pro-lockdown. There's been attempts to feed that into a culture where it hasn't really caught on here in the same extent that it has in the United States. But I think probably a more nuanced argument is not to say, we're leaving the lockdown too fast. But although, you could say that. But the bigger issue for me is that our priorities are completely wrong. Because every time we push people into work, every time we open a new pub or open, unnecessary shopping centers, etc., that is all measures which mean that it's less likely that we are able to do the essential things like get kids back into school. And that's the argument that I think the opposition could have been making at this period in time. It looks like that is going to be the kind of politics we are looking at over the next 1, 2, 3 months. Although we still haven't heard the Conservatives admit that. They are still trying to say there is no trade-off between health and the economy. Chris Whitty disagreeing there. What this seems, I suppose, most at odds with, though, the fact that he's saying we are at the very limit of the extra things we can do. There is nothing else we can increase, no activity we can add to the current panoply of things we can do without removing something else. We are also in a situation where Boris Johnson is saying, even if you're working from home and it's fine, if your boss wants you to go in, you should go in. So he's literally telling you got the chief medical officer there saying, if we do anything more than what we're already doing, we're going to go over the edge. And then you've got Boris Johnson saying, it's time for you to go back into work, to get on public transport, to get there, and to sit in a room full of people outside of your household when you absolutely don't need to be there. And as we've said before on this show, this is all to save pret-a-manger and to make sure that bosses can properly oversee their workers, who can make sure they're not watching YouTube videos in between Zoom meetings or reading an article, heaven forbid. All right, we're going to go on to our next clip. So, as is often the case with new announcements on COVID guidelines, much of the scrutiny on the most recent changes has focused on how they were communicated. So the localized lockdown in the northwest of England was announced late last night on Twitter amid loads of confusion. They announced it before they'd published the document with the rules in detail. The Department for Health first were briefing that whilst different households will not be able to meet in each other's houses, they will be able to meet in the pub. And obviously that's completely ridiculous. It's safer actually to meet people from other households in your house than in a pub with tens and 20, hundreds of households. It's a big pub, I suppose. But they rolled back on that. It turns out that you're just not allowed to meet people from different households anywhere other than in the park. So they backtracked on that. It's now, more reasonable than it first seemed, but it is still confusing. And when, criticisms are thrown at the government to say, all of these regulations, I don't understand them. What the government cheerleaders normally say is you're just pretending to be confused. What you are is embittered left-wing pundits who just want to attack a successful government. But that argument falls apart when you look at this interview with Matt Hancock this morning, because he wasn't really, he evidently wasn't clear about what the rules were because he got it wrong. Take a look.
The evidence is that places of work are less of an impact in terms of the spread of the disease.
But what about household to household?
So the people should abide by the social distancing guidelines. The law that we're bringing in is that 2 households cannot meet in the area defined, but obviously any 2 households who are meeting should follow the social distancing guidelines.
So a household from Greater Manchester can go to a household outside one of these outside one of these areas that have been defined?
Following social distancing rules.
Okay.
So that was pretty clear. Matt Hancock said, if you live in one of the areas where restrictions have been put in place, Greater Manchester, for example, you can, if you want to, go and visit someone in their home if they live in a different part of the country. So you can drive up to Glasgow and visit a different household there. You just can't visit a household on your street. The problem, that would be a bit of a bizarre rule anyway. I'm glad it's not, but it's also illegal. Matt Hancock was telling you to break the law just then if you live in Greater Manchester. So let's now look at a bit on the government website where they've sort of codified these regulations. That also went out this morning, kind of at the same time Matt Hancock was speaking. So you can see there, North of England, local restrictions, and we can go down to the section, what will be illegal? And it says it will be illegal for people who do not live together to meet in a private home or garden, except for limited exceptions to be set out in law. You should not host or visit people you do not live with unless they're in your support bubble. If you live in the affected areas, you should not visit someone's home or garden, regardless of whether this is in or outside of the restricted area. So he's gone on, he's the health secretary. He's in charge of these rules and regulations. He's supposed to be, the buck stops with him, really. Ultimately with Boris Johnson, but he's supposed to be the person who, of everyone, is on top of his brief. And he went on BBC Breakfast and encouraged you to break a law he had just made, right? Ridiculous. And you could say, look, we're moving. It's a very fast-moving situation. It's better that they introduce a lockdown quickly or introduce new regulations quickly than that they make sure they've got the comms right straight away. I think, that would be a good argument. The problem is that what has happened here in the northwest of England is not something that is completely out of the blue, in the sense that Boris Johnson has been saying for weeks, for months even, that the government's strategy is that when we see spikes in different areas, they will implement what they're calling local lockdowns, or a whack-a-mole strategy in Boris Johnson's colourful language. Now, if that was the strategy, then how can it be that when that predicted and predictable thing happens, which is you see a spike in a particular area, Matt Hancock goes on TV having no idea what the government response is supposed to be? It should be quite a simple, straight out of the box response. We see a spike in this area. That means we introduce these regulations, which I, as the health secretary, understand. We are going to bring in Aaron Bastani. Welcome to the show tonight.
Thank you, Michael, for illuminating so much so quickly. You did.
What do you make? Did you watch the press conference today? What do you make of it all?
I didn't see this press conference. No, I mean, I've been keeping a sort of abreast of things through Twitter and following you. Actually, I would implore everybody who's watching this right now to follow Michael on Twitter. No, it's true, because I often with these things, I'm like, I'm going to tweet about this, and I realize, Michael's kind of done the tweet already. Okay, I'll just retweet him. Everything coronavirus related, you're very on top of.
Well, it's all the shit's hitting the fan a little bit again.
It does feel that's this. Sorry, can I just say quickly? Because you really, I think you hit the Premier League in your coverage of the coronavirus, particularly after early March. And it does feel like Michael Walker's coming to the fore again. I got
quite relaxed about it, to be honest, I have to say. I just felt like, the sun was out. I mean, to be honest, it's interesting. The deaths are, even though we're seeing spikes in cases and we're seeing similar levels of government incompetence, we aren't seeing sort of a rise in deaths. It's interesting. In Leicester, there's actually, if you watched Newsnight last night, some controversy, because whilst the lockdown was imposed because cases increased, they haven't really seen any corresponding increase in hospital admissions. And it seems that no one has worked out that puzzle. So we are in.
Well, it does suggest that in the early months of this thing, around sort of March, April, May, it does suggest that carers were going into elderly care homes and they were the equivalent of biological weapons, and the government wasn't really doing much about it. I mean, the sheer weight of this crisis so early on compared to what's now happening, you're absolutely right. The analog isn't quite there yet. It would suggest something went very badly wrong with elderly care this spring.
Actually going to look at some more bad news, I suppose. This is not a new development, but something which we suspected, which has been confirmed, which is that England has had the highest level of excess deaths in Europe during this coronavirus crisis. So whilst, when you saw those graphs about comparative deaths being put up at daily Downing Street briefings, until it became clear that, England's were worse than most of our neighbors, the government's line was to say you can't compare deaths. You're comparing apples with pears. The idea that you can say more people have died in Britain than elsewhere would be premature. Now we've looked at what is the gold standard way of seeing who has sadly passed away because of the coronavirus crisis, which is excess deaths. That means the number of deaths over and above the average you would see for this period of time. So it would include people who died from coronavirus, but potentially people who died because they had to wait for an operation, et cetera, et cetera. It gives you the overall evaluation of the government's response to this particular crisis. And obviously, England especially has come out at the bottom of the league. There is no way you can pretend this is anything other than an appalling record for this government. But as I mentioned in my introduction, even if you cannot put lipstick on a pig, I suppose, to use a phrase, to say you cannot dress this up as anything other than a failure. What you can do is blame another group of people for that failure. And you don't win any prizes for guessing who Conservative MPs are going on national radio and pointing the finger at. So we're going to take a look at Craig Whittaker. He is Tory MP for Calder Valley, speaking to Ian Payne on LBC last night.
It's nothing to do with Eid as far as I'm concerned, but what it is, and what I have seen in my constituency, is that we have areas of our community and sections of our community that are just not taking the pandemic serious.
So it is the Muslim community?
Of course, and if you look at the areas where we've seen rises and cases, the vast majority, not by any stretch of the imagination, all areas, but it is the BME communities that are not taking this seriously enough. I mean, you look at all the areas. We've got Bradford, Calderdale, Kirklees, and we have Bradford in particular, and Kirklees have two of the largest populations in West Yorkshire.
Right. So we're talking sort of immigrant communities, are we?
We are.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, immigrant and Asian population.
And this is really, really cynical. And it's not just cynical, it's actually quite dangerous, I think, because what the government are doing, they're putting restrictions on people. And by putting those extra restrictions on people, you can create resentment towards the government, perhaps. And I think, to be honest, fair enough. If you want to be annoyed at the government because you can't go into each other's homes, potentially, in this situation, many people had celebrations for Eid planned, which have had to be cancelled. Now, you could say, look, maybe we could have, visited our family members in their households if the government hadn't been so cavalier in encouraging people back to work, for example, and encouraging people back into pubs, and saying it was your civic duty to go out in public, to go into indoor spaces with strangers and spend money. That, for me, is why the R, it seems, has gone above 1, why cases are rising. But that is not where the government wants you to direct your anger. They want you to direct it at each other. And in this case, they're saying direct it at the brown people, the Muslims, because they all hang out together. They live in big families. They can't understand English. That's one of the lines that has been thrown out recently. And it is really, I think, stoking hatred. And you could say, in defense, you can say this is a Tory backbench MP. He doesn't represent the government. But let's look at the choreography of this, right? So what happens is, up until late last night, no one knew anything other than, this is all going quite well, apart from in Leicester, right? Now, late last night at 11:30, in certain parts of the Northwest, many of them with high BAME populations, not universally, they say, oh, we are going to stop people going into each other's houses. You get lots of right-wing pundits and right-wing newspapers saying, oh, this is all the unsaid thing. This is all to stop Eid celebrations because we know that must be what the government are worried about, but they don't want to mention it. Now, then you get these kind of outrider MPs who are going on radio and saying, oh, yeah, that is the reason. Obviously, Matt Hancock isn't going to say, yeah, we're doing this to clamp down on the Muslims, because they need plausible deniability. But these outrider MPs can go on, say it explicitly. Then this morning, you have kind of, I suppose, the right-wing shock jocks like Julia Hartley-Brewer talking to Matt Hancock saying, like, isn't this basically a cultural issue because Muslims aren't following the rules? I think she said BAME people. I can't remember exactly how she defined the community, but that was the gist of it. And Matt Hancock gets to say, oh, I wouldn't necessarily want to say that. So they get to play the good guy, but they've got the outriders saying the nasty thing, which is what they really want you to hear. And then at midday today, you have Boris Johnson saying this is actually a nationwide problem. We thought we were on a path to recovery, but because people aren't following the rules, or because whatever, X, Y, Z, we're going to actually have to have a little bit of a clampdown. And now in the back of everyone's minds, what have you got at this point? You haven't got, this could be a government failure. You've got, well, it seems like cases are rising. It seems like the national response to coronavirus must be failing. And also in the back of my mind, I've got that, it's the Muslims that break the rules, isn't it? So, I mean, I wouldn't call you a conspiracy theorist if you were suspicious that the whole of this was choreographed, so that when a government failure is announced, you've already got it placed in your head that maybe you should blame someone that doesn't look like you.
What I find so fascinating is they say Asian, immigrants, BAME. I mean, this is like 60% of the UK. Of course, like you said, they mean Muslims. Asia is a big continent. But anyway, in the British context, it's historically meant South Asia. Most South Asians aren't Muslims, okay? Primarily Hindu, they're Sikh, Christians, and then you've got immigrants. I mean, immigrants come from so many places, obviously. And then BAME, I mean, BAME historically includes Jewish people, Roma people. It can, by some definitions in the 80s, it would include Irish people. Even still today, sometimes BAME can include Irish people. So, I mean, it's just this nebulous thing. They're saying BAME, they're saying immigrants, they're saying Asian. They mean Muslim. Just say it. Put the word in your mouth and say Muslims. I don't like them. Just be honest. But like you say, doing this, feeding this through Times Radio, LBC, Talk Radio, I really think that these particular platforms are the 21st century equivalent of The Sun, The Mail, The Express, The Star in the 20th century. And we need to get to grips with that. The extent to which these sewer systems, which pass for radio stations, feign media legitimacy is something that we really have to take to task. And they mainstream these absurd frames incredibly quickly. We can't get on top of coronavirus. Why? Because of immigrants. Really? I mean, is that the best you can do? Vietnam has hundreds of cases. I think as of last week, it had no deaths. Maybe it's had 1 or 2 deaths now. That research has been corroborated by Oxford University. Cuba, we're talking again hundreds of deaths. Japan, a country of 140 million people, we're talking, I think, less than 1,000 deaths. South Korea, we're talking a country of around 40 million people. We're talking 300 to 400 deaths. So the idea that, the variable here is, a large Muslim population. It's not. It's about a state which is completely inept at doing very basic things like telling people to wear masks, shutting schools, and most importantly, demobilizing the economy in the short term for the long-term interests of business too. And that's something in which the Conservatives have not done. Paul Mason, you had him on the show. I think he put it very lucidly. He said the best thing, if you want to save the economy, the best thing you can do is to stop a second wave of this thing. And we've done the complete opposite of that. And I find it remarkable that you have the exact same government with, like you say, plausible deniability, looking to blame immigrants, and just a couple of weeks ago, encouraging people to go out and eat in restaurants, cafes, bars, with tokens literally paid for by central government. I mean, the hypocrisy, the double standard, the duplicity, I mean, that's nothing new. But you have to ask a question, at what point does this bridge break? It's so absurd. Blaming immigrants has been a very successful electoral political strategy in this country for a very long time. But I just don't see how it works here. If your grandparent dies, if your boss at work dies, your co-worker dies, and you're going to recognize there's a big rupture here between the sort of ideological explanation from the likes of Julia Hartley-Brewer and the reality of the situation, which is the government's completely ineffective. So I do wonder if it will come to bite the government back on the arse. Perhaps not. I mean, I've said that many times in regards to right-wing populist mythology. We'll see.
I think it could quite easily be perhaps not, because it's also about what are you debating. Every 10 minutes they're debating whether or not Muslims are more likely to break lockdown rules, obviously completely ridiculous. Is a moment they're not debating why Boris Johnson is telling you to go back into work at the same time that Chris Whitty, the chief medical officer, is saying that every time anyone does one action, that's someone else who can't do something. So what the government should be saying, right, is, and I'm not in favor of this idea that we should fearmonger and tell everyone it's not safe to go outside, etc. But the message should be, look, if you need to do something, do it. And that doesn't have to be, you're going to die if you don't do it. If you feel like you really need to do something for your emotional well-being, whatever, go for it. But if you don't, maybe don't. And that will mean that someone else gets to do something. So we could have this
the government comms advisor.
Well, but that's not what they want to do, because if you had a sort of humanist understanding of how now I'm sounding like Paul Mason actually, but if you had a compassionate understanding of what should be the societal response to coronavirus, it should be to say you're doing your national duty, not by locking yourself up in your home. Like, yes, if you're shielding, unfortunately, that might be what you judge you have to do, but not by, not through having sort of overwhelming fear about going outside, but thinking like, I could go to the pub tonight, but to be honest, if I don't need to, then maybe I'll just go to the park, or maybe I'll just invite one friend round, etc., etc. And then you do it if you need to, and you don't if you don't. The government have done this completely different thing, which they've said, even if you might like to have a takeaway, which is obviously safer than going to a restaurant, go to the restaurant. In fact, we'll give you half-price vouchers to go to the restaurant. They come in on Monday, by the way. So the timing of all this is completely bizarre. And they are saying it is your national duty to do things you don't need to do, even if they risk spreading coronavirus.
Protect GDP at all costs. But if there is a second wave, that's your fault, particularly if you're BAME. I mean, it's outlandish.
We've got 1,700 watching. Let's get to 2,000 tonight. And a big thanks to Jack Millership, who has kindly donated a £50 super chat. He says, great job continuing to hold the government to account, and Eid Mubarak to all my Muslim friends watching. I echo that from Jack Millership, Eid Mubarak. And I suppose our commiserations if you live in the Northwest and you had some plans that you will not be able to fulfill. Harriet Kane with $4.99. Oh, that's very kind. Michael is a national treasure indeed. Thank you very much, Harriet. You've made my Friday evening. We're going to go on to our next story. Before we do that, share the show link. Tweet on the hashtag TiskySour. Give us a like and go to NavarroMedia.com/support to keep Navarro Media growing and this show on the road. Lawfare is a practice of fighting political battles through often spurious legal means, and with left-wing activists getting sued left, right, and centre by wealthy celebrities and ex-Labour staff members pledging to bankrupt the party unless they expel Jeremy Corbyn. It's a concept which seems relevant in Britain today. One person who was sued in the battles ensuing over what can and cannot be said about one's political opponents on social media is Jane Heybroek. Jane was sued for libel in 2019 after retweeting a blog post critical of Rachel Riley and Tracy Ann-Oberman. The post in question was titled, "Beneath Contempt, How Tracy Ann-Oberman and Rachel Riley Harassed, Dogpiled and Slandered a 16-year-old Child and Her Father." So this week, Jane had a legal victory, and that is not an easy thing to do when it comes to British libel laws, I can tell you. When Riley and Oberman, so this week, they dropped the case. It had already cost her £80,000, and it is worth mentioning that Jane Heybroek is a barrister. So if, obviously I don't know this, but I would speculate that this was very difficult for a barrister, and if this legal case had been thrown at someone with less legal nous, probably a much earlier settlement would have happened, and it would have been in favour of Rachel Riley and Tracy Ann-Oberman, and it has been the opposite in this case. I spoke to Jane earlier today, and I started by asking her to explain what it's like to get sued for a retweet.
Yes, I retweeted a tweet that contained a link to an article.
And since doing that, you have had to pay, or your court fees have been £65,000. So quite easily, if you were not a barrister, if you were not, go on.
Been a lot more than that. And again, this is one of the issues I had with The Guardian yesterday. I don't know where they got that figure from. I think they must have assumed it was from my crowdfunder. Before they even launched the action, I was already £30,000 out of my own pocket then. So that's November. I'm probably up to about 85 now, of which about 45 has come from Crowd Justice.
Wow.
And just to make things clear, their offer is not to pay all my costs.
Oh, really?
Oh, no.
You're going to be out of pocket even though this settlement has happened?
Yeah.
Wow.
But that's still a win. And I know that sounds like a weird thing to say. It's very rare that cases like this settle for all your costs, because the reason for that, and this is part of the problem with the legal system as well, is that even if I went all the way to court and even if I won in court, all guns blazing, on average, people only get, as defendants, they only get between 60 and 80% of their costs back. Wow. So when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds that it can cost to do something like this, it gets to a point where you're thinking, okay, I could keep going, but how much longer can I keep going? But also, at the end of the day, to settle with there being no confidentiality clause is unusual. Mm-hmm. So I'm able to speak today because there's no confidentiality clause.
Could you talk a bit about the process and how libel laws works? Because, we're going to have loads of viewers who retweet articles all the time, and they don't necessarily assume they're going to be held responsible for whatever was written in that article. And the idea that you could have a celebrity who then, gets a lawyer to send you a letter and you end up having to spend tens of thousands of pounds, that's quite terrifying.
Even for me as a legal professional, it was intimidating. because the stakes are so high. I mean, literally, you're betting with your house, you're betting with everything you own in going ahead and defending something like this. From claimant's point of view, and this is what happened in this case, is that both the claimants were working with a lawyer who works no win, no fee with them. So they don't have to pay him any fees if they lose. But secondly, they can then, and this is something that's available to a lot of people if they choose to do it. Their lawyers can get what's called after the event insurance. What that means is you pay an insurance premium and you pay it in increments the longer the case goes on. But if the claimants lose, they're covered by insurance. There are defences of truth, honest opinions. So in other words, Joe Bloggs in the street could look at the facts and come to the same opinion as what was published. But even the actual publishing of a retweet is not set in law. There is no case law out there that says if you retweet a link to an article that is potentially defamatory, you are the publisher of that article. So without more comment. But so then you go through what do these words that they're complaining about actually mean, and are they statements of truth or are they statements of opinion?
What do you think needs to change in this country? What legal reforms do we need so that we can't have celebrities suing activists online?
Section 1 of the 2013 Defamation Act says, and it's the first thing in the Act says you have to show serious harm. And what tends to happen is that people launch proceedings without actually particularising what that serious harm is. But also the courts need to get hold of that at an early stage as well and kind of do a triage and say, well, hang on a minute, you've put these particulars in, but you've not demonstrated serious harm. This is not going to proceed any further until you do. In my view, it's not enough to say, well, I'm famous and therefore this could have harmed my reputation. And in fact, case law in a case called Lasho pretty much said that as well. You have to show that there is a factual matrix in which it is strongly possible that you were seriously harmed and your reputation was seriously harmed. I think what the courts need to do is take a kind of case management hand of this and start looking at that at an earlier stage.
I think that last answer there was really important, because whilst you might think, oh, justice has been done, she's won the case, or she's, Rachel Riley and Tracy Ann-Oberman have settled because presumably they thought they were not going to be able to defeat her in court. You might think justice has been done, but she has had to put forward £80,000, some of it from, activists on crowd justice. If that weren't the case, then people would have to give in instantly all the time, right? But that last point was to say, this shouldn't be allowed to go forward, because yes, it seems that if they are unable to prove that serious damage was done to their career prospects because an activist retweeted an article, they're unlikely to win the final case. But if it is allowed to proceed, then to clear your name, you have to first of all spend tens of thousands of pounds, right? So most people without legal expertise, without money behind them, or without the wherewithal to start a crowdfunder campaign, whatever, are just going to say, oh, you've sued me, I can't afford this. Especially even if I win, I didn't realize that if you win, you still have to pay a large section of your court fees. I find that completely unbelievable. But anyway, Aaron, this is something we are going to have to, I suppose, get used to on the left. This idea that we have celebrities, ex-staff members, people who are, I suppose, using the legal system to, it seems, kind of intimidate people, really, to say that, you shouldn't be able to say what you think, because you might get a legal letter through the door.
Well, it's important to say that may not be the explicit intention of the people doing it, but that is clearly a side effect. Jane, everybody agrees, didn't commit libel. The case was withdrawn, but these kinds of action clearly have a chilling effect on free speech, and I think that's indisputable. I don't think that's a particularly radical thing to say. Furthermore, English libel law is known as possibly the most progressive in the world. Donald Trump likes it so much, he wants it to go to the United States. If you just Google English libel law, New York Times, Newsweek, Washington Post, article after article in the United States, they look at our libel laws as just utterly ridiculous. And I think this is a really important issue over the next 5, 10, 15 years for people on the left. I'm not even going to say socialists or progressives or radicals. If you just believe in freedom of speech, if you just believe in freedom of expression and equality under the law, and the fact that the wealthy shouldn't be able to buy effectively a legal form of superiority over the rest of us, if you believe in the idea that people should be afforded protection under the law, sort of irregardless of how much they earn and the wealth they've accumulated, then I think you should want a significant change in the law here. And I think there's going to be a number of ways through which this is pursued. We're obviously going to need a strategy which tries to influence policy, influence changes politically, whoever's in government. That's really important. And I think this needs to be attendant with Leveson Mark II in terms of actually creating a real regulator for the press, again, which encourages freedom of speech, but not in a way that is defamatory. Right now, you can get away with defaming people if you're a print publication relatively easily, because again, it's about being skewed to people with resources, unless of course it's completely obvious. And people who do absolutely nothing see their free speech chilled because of those very same laws. So we need to change these laws so they're not so ridiculously and obviously tilted towards the elite. And I also think we need to say to young people, if you're a young person who is a socialist, who believes in social justice, look, you should be considering a career in law. And I say this as somebody who's seen, for instance, activist lawyers with regards to protest. They have done remarkable things. Or Keir Starmer is a great example with Libel, or the fact he's been involved in, repealing the death penalty around the world. By the way, very often the fact that former colonial possessions have the death penalty is thanks to Britain, but that's an entirely different conversation. And this is another example of that, libel and media law. If you're a young socialist, you're not sure about how you can contribute to a cause greater than yourself. I think this is a great place to start. I think if I was 20 and I had my time back again, I think I'd be quite tempted into law. I think it's a very important sphere for socialists to get engaged with. And there's a precedent here. If you look at American conservatives after the 1960s, they didn't just go through think tanks, which they did, and policy and mainstream politics with the Republican Party, also as well the Libertarian Party, more recently the Tea Party. They also saw law itself as a field of contestation, most notably Roe versus Wade, abortion rights, and so on. But actually, it goes far beyond that. And the most strategic, long-sighted libertarians in the US didn't just set up sort of economics faculties, fund economics faculties and think tanks in the US. Think of George Washington, or maybe there's so many. I was going to say Georgetown. It's George Mason University, or Virginia Tech had James Buchanan, had a bunch of neoliberal economists. Very often they also funded law faculties, law schools. And as socialists, we need to understand this is a very, very, very important field of contestation. We need to focus on it as an area of policy change, but also we need a new generation of activist socialist lawyers trying to change things from the bottom up in terms of case law.
We're going to go to our final story, which is another example of, I suppose, the feudal hangovers of our political system, our political and legal system. And before we do that, do share the show link, tweet on the hashtag TiskiSour. Keep your super chats coming. And what we love most, go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. British democracy is a corrupt mess. Planning permission for billion-pound property developments can be bought for the price of a ticket to a Tory fundraiser dinner. And not since 1974 has a party leader become prime minister without the explicit backing of Rupert Murdoch. But without doubt, the most embarrassingly crooked part of the British political system is the House of Lords. And today, 36 new peers were nominated to join the second chamber. They include Evgeny Lebdev, owner of the Evening Standard and the Independent, and host of lavish parties which Boris Johnson has been known to attend. Claire Fox of the Brexit Party, who's also been on this show, and Boris Johnson's brother. And it tells you something about this list, about the British establishment, that the fact that Joe Johnson, the Prime Minister's brother, was nominated by the government, which the Prime Minister leads, to join the second chamber as a life peer, comfortable job with significant power, privilege, influence to a family member. That was one of the least controversial people who are on this particular list, right? We'll talk about Lebdev in a moment because I think it's, the relationship between the media and politics in this country is unbelievable. But first of all, I want to go to actually what I found the most shocking part of the list of who received peerages or who's been nominated for peerage today. And we can get this up from the government list up on screen. So you see nominations for non-affiliated peerages. So I want to go down to the bit with Frank Field and Catherine Hoey. So it's a bit lower down on the website. And you can see there are 5 former Labour MPs who have been nominated. Frank Field, Kate Hoey, Ian Austin, Gisela Stewart, and John Woodcock. Now, these are all ex-Labour MPs that have one thing in common, that in the 2019 general election, they actively campaigned against Jeremy Corbyn becoming the Prime Minister. So John Woodcock, Ian Austin, you might remember them going around London with a billboard saying that they were mainstream and they didn't want you to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. Gisela Stewart told people to vote for the Conservatives. Kate Hoey told people to vote for the DUP. And Frank Field stood as an independent, so obviously telling people not to vote for the Labour Party. Now, that is what unites these people. You can't make this argument that they were the 5 most distinguished people who left the House of Commons in the last year. No, these are 5 people who backed, essentially, well, in one form or another, helped Boris Johnson into Downing Street because they went against the politics of the party which they were members of, against the members of that party, and basically worked against the Labour Party. And now they have all been rewarded with comfortable seats in the House of Lords. You couldn't make it up, could you, Aaron?
You couldn't make it up. Well, we're going to have to disagree, Michael. I don't think that they're the most egregious people on that list, because at least they were parliamentarians. I think it really does speak volumes when the former Prime Minister's husband gets a peerage and the present Prime Minister's brother gets a peerage. I mean, at that point, you've actually gone back to sort of pre-capitalist, not even democratic, pre-liberal kind of ideas of who should rule. You go, it's kind of neo-feudalist ties of blood. It's kind of worrying. And I think, if this was to happen in Iran, if the present, president or, prime minister, most senior sort of politicians, foreign minister or whatever, if their brother was to go into an unelected chamber and at the same time, their predecessor or their successor, their husband or wife was to go into that unelected chamber and they were legislators for life, I think probably a lot of people in this country would say that's sufficient grounds for regime change. Well, guess what? It happens here. And so I think when people ask you the question, what do you think of British democracy? The only appropriate answer is, it sounds like a good idea. Maybe we should try it.
I think actually, I want to get this up because I hadn't mentioned Philip May yet, because I don't think he's going to the House of Lords, but he was knighted, so he's now Sir Philip May. And I want to get up this on the screen again because it tells you why he's been knighted, which I just thought was quite bizarre. Can we get this up, Fox? So the Queen has been graciously pleased to signify her intention of conferring the following honours upon the under-mentioned. It's closed now. Anyway, it says Philip May for political service. We won't be able to get it up on the screen. Don't worry about it. I'll tell you what it says. And this idea that Philip May has been knighted for political service for being the husband of a prime minister, I just find really bizarre. Because they also could have knighted Theresa May. They couldn't have made her a lord. Well, they could only have made her a lord if she wanted to stand out as an MP and there'd be a by-election. But they could have knighted her. But instead they knighted
a dame, yeah.
They knighted her husband for political service, and the political service was being the husband of Theresa May.
Or a Tory party donor.
Was he a Tory party donor before
so.
she was prime minister?
He's an incredibly wealthy man. He's an incredibly wealthy man. Incredibly wealthy. So maybe he's some kind of operator behind the scenes. I don't know. I do know he's very wealthy. He's donated money to the Tory party. Maybe behind the scenes he's been very important at accumulating resources for the party of government. Perhaps. I mean, if that's sufficient grounds for the most esteemed honour from Her Majesty, then okay, fair enough. It shows that the honour itself is worth jack shit, which, by the way, it is. Because, like I say, I mean, goodness me. If this was happening in Iran or Russia, my God, you would have the entire lobby from the Guardian to the Times and the Telegraph would be united in saying how backwards and regressive these people are. It's in Britain. We don't have an elected second chamber. We don't have an elected head of state. We don't have a particularly democratic electoral system. It looks like that a nation that would probably like to leave the union won't be allowed a referendum if it wants to leave. And we have the hairdressers and lackeys and water carriers of political has-beens like David Cameron getting honours, and now they're becoming peers forever. And like you say, I think not far behind Joe Johnson joining the Lords, and not far behind Philip May becoming a Sir. Like you say, these I wouldn't call them Labour, because saying John Woodcock and Ian Austin are Labour, it's like an antimatter and matter. It's like light and a shadow. They are the second that actually the country was offered an agenda which was commensurate with Labour's domestic policy in 1945. They worked 247, 365 to stop the Labour Party. That is why they are now going to be unelected legislators forever. That is their reward. That's how it works. And in a way, it's good that Jeremy Corbyn isn't the leader of the Labour Party anymore, because we can actually say absolutely every last aspect of the British political system is rotten to the core. And today it was like some rotten icing on the cake. It made a putrescent dessert even more disgusting. It's absurd. It's absolutely ridiculous. If this was any other country, if this was China, Observer front page, we need to take out Xi Jinping. Well, hey, it's Boris Johnson. What are you going to do?
Exactly. What do you think about Lebdev, though? I don't know if there's a precedent for giving a peerage to a current chairman of a newspaper. I mean, maybe it happens all the time, and I just wasn't aware of it. But it seems pretty phenomenal.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. Larry Lamb was the first editor at The Sun under Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch buys The Sun at the end of the 1960s. Larry Lamb is the editor. He stays there for about just slightly more than 10 years. Towards the end of the 1970s, Larry Lamb, this is documented, this is known, is writing speeches for Margaret Thatcher. This guy's the editor of the Sun newspaper while writing speeches for Margaret Thatcher. On the day of the 1979 general election, people say that the Sun, the Sun readership, they don't demand much of their readership. They wrote a 1,500-word leader to vote Tory. That's never happened before or since in the Sun newspaper, a 1,500-word leader. This was like something out of the London Review of Books. This was like something out of the Süddeutsche, or the NYT. But no, it was in the Sun, and it was imploring people to vote Conservative. Guess who was made a Sir in the very first New Year's honours of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in 1979, 1980. Guess who was made a Sir, Michael?
Him.
Larry Lamb.
Yeah. Larry
Lamb, the speechwriter, the Tory polemicist, who's posing as the editor of a national newspaper, was made a Sir. So this is pretty run of the mill in terms of Britain's rotten establishment. What I would say is, and this is a really important point, we just had the Russia report. Again, my God, what a flop that was for all the people saying that Russia is subverting this country's democracy. Look across the Atlantic, right? Rather than across the North Sea, and you might actually have a better understanding of who's really trying to subvert British democracy. This guy is the son of a former KGB officer. Right? That's what I don't get. And that was like a national furor. This tells us a few things. Firstly, the Russia report was just a joke. It died in the water. It didn't go anywhere because there was nothing there. It was absurd. I mean,
maybe the fact there's nothing there, Aaron, is itself something being there.
There may be. That's
I'm joking. I don't think there's anything there.
It may be the case, but there was nothing in that report to suggest there is. And so, last week people were having, convulsions about how Russia is trying to subvert British democracy. This week, the media oligarch of a former KGB officer who's now a billionaire is literally made an unelected legislator in the House of Lords. These people make laws which shape all of our lives. Nobody says anything. Why? Because he owns a newspaper.
So true. We're going to finish on some comments. We're going to finish a little bit early today. Vicky Lee with £25. BAME were more visible during this crisis as a large proportion of our essential workers are BAME. They've also been hardest hit. Shame on MPs blaming whole communities for the government's own faults. I think that's such an important comment. And actually, this is going to be one of the big political battles which we have over the next years or the coming years, weeks, months, etc. Because what we saw, at the height of this crisis, when, the whole idea, what the government was singing was the songs of solidarity. So it's decided that these essential workers, we finally, realized what they're all worth. We clap for our carers and people who work in hospitals and people who are delivering food. Everyone, all of these jobs which are dismissed as low paid, low wage, we were finally supposed to all as a nation recognize are incredibly important. Obviously, many of these jobs done by BAME people. That was one of the big reasons why BAME people have been hit disproportionately hard by coronavirus. No, it's not because they break rules. It's because they drive buses. It's because they work in the health service and because they stack shelves in supermarkets, right? Not obviously all BAME people, but these are jobs where BAME people are overrepresented, essential services. And these are the people who, disproportionately were taken by coronavirus because they weren't able, like office workers, to shelter in their homes, right? So BAME people in this country, and maybe, many people don't like the word, it's not a particularly useful word, people of color, have given a lot to the battle against coronavirus. And now we're supposed to all forget that and suddenly go back to the usual language of, the unions are holding us hostage in schools. Nurses don't deserve a pay rise because they already got a deal 2 years ago. Why are they trying to be greedy? And all of Britain's problems because of cultural differences that no one's allowed to speak about, although people speak about them all the time on all of Britain's national radio stations, especially the ones owned by billionaires. So yes, we have to make sure that what the government was saying in March, that frontline services matter, that ordinary workers matter, that people of color matter, that is not able to be all completely forgotten as they try and get us back to the economy as usual and back to politics as usual.
But Michael, can I say?
Yes.
It goes both ways, right? So Labour have been saying things in recent weeks which really are at odds with their initial messaging in March. And now it's really important to remember this. Obviously, late last night, as you started the show with, there was effectively a shutdown of significant parts of society. Millions of people were affected by changes in the rules in Lancashire and bits of Yorkshire and so on. Millions of people were affected. On the very same day, the Shadow Secretary of State for Education, Kate Green, I believe, said that Labour opposes the unions and that when kids go back to school, they don't need to wear masks. Now, I want you to remember that. What was the date? The 30th that happened. That was on the 30th of July, because come September, October, the Labour Party is going to be supremely embarrassed they were saying that. And this tells you a few things. The Tories can get away with this stuff for as long as they have an opposition which does the exact same thing, because we have an opposition which, I hate to tell you, Ian Dunt and James O'Brien and pretty much everybody at The Observer, this opposition isn't opposing, right? You can't say there has not been a single significant policy suggestion from the opposition on coronavirus. Their only thing is they need to communicate policy better. Great. I agree. Is that your only contribution to the biggest public health crisis this country has endured in a century? Really? That's the best you can say? Well, we agree with absolutely every last word they're saying, every policy they're going to roll out, but can they not tweet at 11:30 at night? Are you for real? Are you for real? This is a country of 65 million people. We've lost perhaps 50,000 people already plus. The economy's plunged, and that's before round 2. And you're saying, can we have formal press releases rather than tweets at midnight? Come on. So the Tories aren't going to change. The Tories can get away with this for as long as we don't have an opposition. And we don't. I don't care how much gel is in the leader of the opposition's hair, right? I'm not going to throw stones from glass houses. But for God's sake, Keir, do better.
Yes, a lot of good points. Well made. There, Anthony Sinadinos with a $9.99 super chat. Take my monies off topic from the current debate, but let's not forget Julian Assange currently being tortured by UK government. I suppose whether he's being tortured is probably disputed, but as you will see from a mini documentary we made, I think the case against him being extradited to the United States for espionage is a terrifying precedent for the rights of whistleblowers everywhere. He published leaked documents which were absolutely in the public interest. Now Donald Trump is using an espionage charge against him, which has never been used against a journalist before Obama decided not to use it, even though, they wanted to extradite Assange as well, but they decided that that was a step too far. Obviously, there aren't many steps that are too far for Donald Trump. And now it seems that our government are going to willingly hand over this man who published documents which, had massive public interest behind them to face, well, a life sentence fundamentally in the United States. So yeah, if you want to know more about that, we did a mini doc earlier in the year with, we spoke to some really significant people, Jen Robinson, his lawyer, Yanis Varoufakis, definitely worth a watch. And we've also got a £10 super chat from Vanta Black. And Fox is informing me that Vanta Black regularly donates to our streams on the super chat function. So thank you very much. Of course, if you do want to support us directly, you can do so at novaramedia.com/support. Aaron, any final words from you?
Yeah, I think that the Assange thing is really, really important. I think this is one of the great obstructions of freedom of expression and journalistic freedom in the Anglophone world in living memory. This guy is being charged. I mean, we detail this in, dare I say, forensic detail in our documentary. This guy is being charged with effectively political offences. These were offences drawn up a century ago, which relate to espionage. And it's Julian Assange today, but they could equally be applied to any journalist. The editor at The Guardian, Michael Walker at Novara Media, his analysis of the coronavirus is simply too good. It could be applied
to The Guardian, because they don't publish anything that security services don't like at the moment.
No, that's true. But Alan Rusbridger did some very controversial things as editor at The Guardian. In a way, his successor hasn't. I mean, she's been, politically speaking, she's been terrible for the newspaper. We don't need to go into that. Alan Rusbridger made some really brave choices. Running the Snowden story was a really brave thing to do for a paper which historically is, it's quite lily-livered and liberal. That's about as radical as The Guardian's going to get. Good for them. It's a huge story, huge public interest. But the point is that the charge that's now being, thrown at Assange can be used against anybody. And there's a big problem when, in a society, a journalist is being treated under espionage. That is to say, they are being regarded as a foreign spy. There's clearly no evidence of that. Nobody thinks that Assange is a spy for anyone. That's not even being sort of publicly asserted by the State Department. It's just the legal means by which they can get him back into America, get him in a maximum security prison, and hopefully, make sure he doesn't have human contact with the rest of the world until the day he dies. That's their plan. And that's all happening to a journalist. That's all happening to a person who managed to get some hugely important stories out to the global public 10 years ago. And the fact it's not receiving much coverage in the mainstream media is shocking. If you told me in 2010 this will happen to Julian Assange, how do you think even the Daily Mail would reply? I would say, well, there is a certain basic integrity. It's a false one, but they believe themselves that they are defenders of free speech. They believe that they are defenders of a free and independent media which can't be silenced by the state. That's not happened, and so I think it's a hugely important case. And it can't be understated in terms of its historical precedence in many ways. We look at these milestones in the rolling back of liberal democracy. This is a big one.
We've got one last super chat from Rob Hogg 68, 15 quid. Thank you very much. Exactly, Aaron. I'm all for constructive opposition, but that constructive opposition would be supporting the line of the NEU, so the National Education Union, taking a lead from the BMA on masks, putting forward Labour policies. And that is something we are going to be, I suppose, that we bring up a lot on the show, which is that none of us want to attack the leader of the opposition for its own sake, but let's hear some more concrete, not just constructive opposition, concrete opposition, standing up for the people who this government are desperate for us all to forget about. You've been watching Tysky Sour. We'll be back on Monday. Great guests next week. I'm Michael Walker. This is Novara Media. Good night.